August 17, 2022, 9:11 a.m. Preface and Introduction. The course covers selected counties where we interpret Article 1 of the Tennessee State Constitution as it affords Tennesseans certain rights where through the eyes of slaves in the Royal Assembly of Greater Men a window into history is opened.
Preface. It was not surprising that the South changed little after the Civil War, because though the Union was in control, the attitude of Southern leaders toward blacks remained unchanged as the atmosphere allowed for little movement outside that of the Grand Consistory of Royal Assemblies. Under the umbrella of the Grand Consistory blacks found more than just an association, but a new avenue to distinguish themselves apart from the average slave prior to the war and freedman after the war. To combat the strength of the Grand Consistory whose influence lifted many blacks above whites socially, economically, and morally, amendments were passed under President Grant to reinforce American patriotism. The concept of royalty and nobility in blacks produced a gap where many blacks fell between the two extremes of the English monarchy and our democracy. The year of 1871 was a turning point in the history of the world as Grant passed the Force Acts to enforce the 13th and 14th Amendments. The first Force Act was aimed at the Ku Klux Klan in May of 1870, which prohibited people from banding together in disguise with intentions to violate citizens' constitutional rights. Senator Oliver Morton, a Republican from Indiana, requested that Grant communicate info on the incidences of resistance. The reports were referred to Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts of the outrages in southern states. Known as the KKK Acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment would be enforced in February of 1871, but the Royal Assemblies had their own hierarchy where the KKK recognized its organization and harassed non-affiliates. The Second Force Act of 1871 required the federal government to control elections where US Marshals were sent to police local polling stations. The Third Force Act of April 1871 allowed Grant to define conspiracies through an armed offensive and suspend the rights of habeas corpus. The black vote was well on its way to what we see today, as those who were not greater men could define themselves under the U.S. Before there was only the Royal Assembly.
Introduction. Speaking of the world pre-1871, we have to see how the United States fell into play, and when we speak of the world we are mainly talking about Europe. After the American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution beginning in 1789 would end in 1799 and the rise of Napoleon I. The concept of nobility was reserved for an even smaller audience as ordinary people began to define themselves as more than just serfs and subjects in the name of liberty. The concept of human equality allowed the lowest in audacity to compete with the highest. What is a king but a man? What is his subject but a man? However, then what is a man's slave but something that looks like a man? Without a nation or a state they are physically, mentally, and perhaps even intellectually human but lack the association with a nation and the benefits of a state. Seeing the American and French revolutions as sparks of a raging fire in the hubris of common folk, King George III abolished the slave trade in 1807, but it wasn't until 1833 and William Wilberforce's campaign that slavery would be abolished in most of the British Empire. The relationship between England and the colonies and the French monarch and his people was bound to happen to slave masters and their unwilling servants, but to greater men it was of little concern. As they mastered what they learned and spread that knowledge to other greater men so they would be more marketable, the barrier between ordinary slaves and extraordinary slaves widened. As only ordinary slaves with no skills, poor attitudes, and inefficient work habits were sent to the auction block, those who wanted could be transferred as they wished. More valuable slaves lived rather happy lives, because they knew how to communicate better whether in words or through their work to their superiors. Coping with their situation, greater men may have looked like slaves, because they were black, but they could be distinguished from others by their attitude and stature. Seeing this gap widen, it would only be a matter of time before the US would succumb to that position of freeing slaves to dilute the power of the Royal Assemblies, however reluctantly. In 1866, looking at Europe, the House of Hanover with Queen Victoria ruled England, the Pope was Pius IX, Napoleon III was Emperor of France, but Otto von Bismarck's military strategy would soon lead to the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, July 19, 1870 to May 10, 1871. The defeat of Napoleon III meant a lot to the Americans, because France represented its people, while the monarchy of Prussia and the German Emperor Wilhelm I threatened the fabric of democracy. In January of 1871, the Second Reich at the Palace of Versailles was born. It was not easy for nobility seemingly anywhere the US or French had any influence from the revolutions to 1871. The coup that thrust Napoleon I into position as French consulate abolished the royal directory, effectively putting an end to future claims to the French throne after their revolution. The bloodthirsty French combed the countryside for anyone the slightest amount of royal blood. Luxembourg kept what part of the royal directory it could and was a haven for exiled priests, royalists, and others with Jacobean sentiment. Why? Well, because of the age-old battle between Catholics and Protestants, where the Americans couldn't side with the French because they were more Protestant than Catholic, and they couldn't side with the Prussian order because they would again be subject to England and its heir apparent Edward, who would rule England after Queen Victoria being from the royal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in Germany. The democracy had to be reinforced, and leaving blacks to fend for themselves would prove to be a great mistake because the human mind automatically reverts to the stability of a monarch. Monarchs just continue the work of their fathers, who are married to their mothers for political breeding purposes. The royal assemblies had to be stopped somehow so that black men would breed with white women for political reasons as in the following.
That concludes the information for this session. Next Wednesday we will discuss Chapter 1 Franklin County and the lives of greater men there. We can't wait to see you there.